My name is Danielle Marsh. I am 34 years old and I am going to tell you about 2 dinners. The first one happened on Easter Sunday 2 years ago in my mother's house at a table set for 14 people with a glazed ham at the center and my grandmother's good china and the particular kind of forced cheerfulness that descends on large family gatherings when everyone has agreed, wordlessly and collectively, to pretend that the tensions underneath the surface do not exist. The second one happened 18 months later in a banquet room at a Marriott hotel, at a retirement party for a woman who had spent 31 years as a school district administrator and who wanted, in front of 60 of her colleagues and friends and family members, to be celebrated by the people who loved her most. She asked me to give the keynote speech. I'm going to tell you everything that happened between those 2 dinners. But first I need you to understand something about the first one. Because without understanding the first one, the second one is just a story about a speech. And it is not a story about a speech. It is a story about what happens when a person finally stops trying to earn something that was never going to be given freely and starts building something that cannot be taken away. It is a story about the specific quiet power of deciding that you are the only audience whose opinion of your life actually matters. And it starts at an Easter table with a glazed ham going cold and my mother's voice carrying clearly across 14 people in a room that had gone very, very still. Let me tell you who I was 2 years ago because context matters. I was 32 years old. I had left a stable corporate marketing job 18 months earlier to start my own consulting firm, working with small and mid-sized businesses on brand positioning and digital strategy. I had 2 clients when I left. I had 11 when Easter arrived. The business was not yet profitable in the way that looks impressive on paper, but it was growing steadily and I was building it carefully and I was, for the first time in my professional life, doing work that felt like mine rather than work I was performing competently for someone else's vision. I was also, at that point, doing the thing that people who leave stable jobs to start businesses always do in the early stages, which is quietly absorbing the financial stress of building something from nothing while publicly projecting a confidence that is about 60% genuine and 40% necessary. I was not failing. But I was not yet succeeding in a way that was visible to people who measure success by salary figures and job titles and the kind of institutional credibility that comes from having a recognizable company name on your business card. My mother's name is Patricia Marsh. She is 63 years old and she is, in many genuinely true ways, a remarkable woman. She spent 31 years in public school administration, working her way from a classroom aide position to a district-level director of curriculum and instruction. She is organized, driven, and possesses a work ethic that I inherited directly and have always been grateful for. She is also a woman who has, for as long as I can remember, communicated love and concern primarily through the language of worry, whose approval has always been conditional in the particular way that makes you keep reaching for it, because it appears just often enough to seem attainable and withdraws just reliably enough to ensure you never quite feel you have it securely. I know this about her. I have known it for years. I say it not as an accusation but as a fact about the dynamic between us that had shaped my entire adult life up to and including the moment I walked into her house that Easter Sunday carrying a bottle of wine and a fruit tart from the good bakery and the hopeful, slightly braced feeling I always carried into family gatherings. The hopeful part was habit. The braced part was experience. There were 14 of us at that table. My mother. My father, Gerald, who is a gentle man of few words who has spent 40 years loving my mother by not contradicting her in public. My brother Kevin, who is 3 years older than me, works in finance and has always occupied the position of family success story with the ease of someone who never had to work for the designation. Kevin's wife, Amber. Their 2 children. My Aunt Susan and her husband. My Uncle Dale and his wife, Cheryl. 3 cousins. My grandmother, Nana Ruth, who is 81 years old, sharp as a tack, and one of the only people at that table whose opinion I trusted completely. And me. I had arrived alone because I had ended a relationship 4 months earlier, a decision that had been correct and that I did not regret but that had left me for the time being without a buffer at family events. A partner, I had learned over the years, served a useful function at gatherings like this one. They gave you someone to exchange a look with. Someone to squeeze your hand under the table. Someone whose presence reminded the room that you were a complete person with a full life rather than a problem to be assessed and advised upon. Without one, I was just Danielle. Available for assessment. The first hour was fine. Better than fine, actually. The food was good and the conversation was easy, and my grandmother had pulled me aside before dinner to tell me that she had been reading about digital marketing and that what I was doing sounded like exactly the right move at exactly the right time, and that she was proud of me. I had held on to that. Tucked it somewhere useful. The trouble started, as it often does at family gatherings, with a question that sounded innocent. My Aunt Susan, who is my mother's younger sister and who has always operated as her echo in family dynamics, asked me how the business was going. I said it was going well. That I had 11 clients now, up from 2 when I started. That I was focusing on building recurring revenue. That I expected to be in the black by the end of the year. But are you actually making money? She asked. In the tone of someone asking whether a child's lemonade stand was turning a profit. I said I was covering my expenses and building toward profitability, which was the standard trajectory for a consulting business in its first 2 years. My Uncle Dale nodded in a way that suggested he was being generous by not saying what he was thinking. My mother, who had been quiet up to this point, set down her fork. And then she said it. Not in a whisper. Not as an aside. Purry. Across the full length of a table set for 14 people, in the particular carrying voice of a woman who has spent 31 years projecting to the back of large rooms. Danielle gave up a perfectly good career to chase something that isn't working. I don't say that to be cruel. I say it because someone in this family needs to be honest with her. She had a salary, benefits, a future. Now she has a website and 11 clients who could leave tomorrow. I worry about her constantly. I think we all do. The table went quiet. Not the quiet of people who are shocked. The quiet of people who have been given permission to think something they were already thinking. I felt the full 14-person weight of that quiet land on me simultaneously. No. I need you to stay with me here, because this is the moment that the story actually begins. Not at the retirement party. Not in the 18 months that followed. Right here. In this quiet. Because what I did in the next 30 seconds determined everything that came after. I did not cry. I did not defend myself loudly or emotionally in a way that would have confirmed whatever picture my mother had just painted. I did not look at my father for rescue, because I had learned long ago that rescue from this particular quarter was not something I could rely on. I picked up my fork. I cut a piece of ham. I chewed it. I swallowed. And then I looked at my mother from across the table and said in a voice that I kept completely, deliberately even, I appreciate your concern, Mom. I'm going to be fine. She made a sound that was not quite a response. My Aunt Susan nodded sympathetically. My Uncle Dale found something interesting on his plate. Nana Ruth, from her end of the table, caught my eye. He gave me a single small nod. I held on to that too. I want to be honest with you about what Easter Sunday felt like after I drove home. I sat in my car in my apartment parking lot for about 20 minutes before I went inside. Not crying. Just sitting with the particular weight of public humiliation delivered by the person whose opinion you have spent your entire life trying to influence. There is a specific kind of hurt that comes from being diminished in front of people by someone who is supposed to be in your corner. It is different from being hurt by a stranger or an enemy. A stranger's contempt slides off you. A parent's contempt has the particular quality of something that was always there, waiting, and has finally been said out loud where everyone could hear it. I want you to understand how that felt. Because the next part of this story only makes sense if you understand the weight of what I was carrying when I walked into my apartment that evening, poured myself a glass of wine, sat at my kitchen table and made a decision. The decision was this. I was going to stop. Not stop the business. Not stop trying. Not stop being present at family gatherings or answering my mother's calls or any of the external things. I was going to stop needing her to see me. That sounds simple. It is not simple. It is In fact, one of the hardest things a person can do, because the need for parental approval is not a rational thing that responds to rational arguments. It is wired into something older and deeper than reason. But I had been sitting at that table for 32 years waiting to be seen accurately by a woman who had a fixed idea of what I was. And the cost of that waiting had become too high. I was done paying it. What I was going to do instead was build something so undeniable that the question of her approval would eventually become irrelevant. Not to prove her wrong. To prove myself right. Before I tell you what the next 18 months looked like, I need to ask you something. Have you ever been in a room where someone who was supposed to love you made you smaller in front of people? Where the person who should have been your loudest defender became, in one public moment, your most credible critic? If you have, and I think more people have than would ever admit it, then you know that there are two things you can do with that moment. You can let it define the ceiling of what you believe you're capable of. Or you can let it become the last time you need their permission to take yourself seriously. Tell me in the comments which one you chose. Because I want to know. And now let me tell you what I did. The Monday after Easter I did 3 things. The first was that I called my therapist, a woman named Dr. Sandra Okafor, who I had been seeing on and off for 4 years. And I told her exactly what had happened at the table. She listened. Then she said something I have thought about nearly every day since. The story your mother told about you at that table is not evidence. It is a hypothesis. Your job for the next year is not to argue with the hypothesis. It is to run the experiment. I wrote that down. The second thing I did was open my laptop and spend 3 hours reviewing my business with a level of unflinching honesty I had been partially avoiding. Not because I was afraid of what I would find, but because I had been running partly on momentum and optimism, and I needed to know clearly and without flattery exactly where I stood and exactly what needed to change. What I found was this. The business was real. The clients were real. The work was good. I had the feedback and the retention numbers to demonstrate that. But the revenue model was too dependent on one-off projects and not structured enough around retained, recurring relationships. I was undercharging consistently, which is the most common mistake early consultants make. Because undercharging feels like a competitive advantage and is actually a slow drain on both finances and perceived value. I had been building a business shaped by my own insecurity rather than by the actual value of what I was offering. That was going to change. The third thing I did was call my most trusted client, a woman named Renee who ran a regional chain of wellness studios and whose business I had helped grow 38% in 14 months. And ask her for an honest conversation about value and pricing. She laughed. I've been wondering when you were going to raise your rates, she said. I've been recommending you to people and telling them to lock you in before you figure out what you're worth. I raised my rates the following week. By 40% across the board. Not one client left. The next 18 months were the most focused and productive of my professional life. I want to tell you about them in detail because the detail matters. Not because I want to recite accomplishments, I don't. But because I want you to understand what it actually looks like practically and specifically when a person stops performing for an audience that will never be satisfied and starts building for themselves. It looks like this. It looks like early mornings that feel different from the early mornings before. Because the work you are doing has stopped being something you are trying to justify and has started being something you are trying to perfect. It looks like decisions made from clarity rather than from the low-grade anxiety of needing to look successful before you are successful. It looks like saying no to clients who are not the right fit, which I had never done before Easter because every client felt like proof I was viable. After Easter I understood that the wrong clients were actually evidence of the wrong positioning. And that strategic selectivity was not arrogance but accuracy. By month 6 I had restructured my entire service offering. 3 clear packages. Retained monthly relationships rather than one-off projects. A minimum engagement that reflected the actual value of what I was delivering. By month 9 I had 23 clients. 17 of them on retainer. By month 12 I was profitable. Not marginally profitable. Meaningfully profitable. in a way that showed up in my bank account and in my ability to make decisions without the background hum of financial anxiety that had accompanied the first 18 months of the business. By month 15 I had been featured in 2 industry publications, invited to speak at a regional marketing conference, and had turned away 4 prospective clients because they were not the right fit, and I no longer needed to take every opportunity that presented itself. I did not call my mother to report any of this. I did not post about it on social media in the way that is actually aimed at a specific audience rather than a general one. I just worked, and built, and watched the business become, month by month, the thing I had believed it could be on the day I left my corporate job, when the believing was an act of faith rather than evidence. My relationship with my mother during those 18 months was cordial and contained. I want to be precise about what that means. I did not cut her off. I did not send an angry letter or have a confrontation about Easter. I did not recruit family members to my side or nurse the wound publicly or do any of the things that feel satisfying in the immediate aftermath of being hurt and become complicated and costly over time. I answered her calls. I saw her at family events. I was warm and present and gave her nothing to point to as evidence of drama or difficulty on my part. What I gave her was the absolute minimum of information about my professional life. Not because I was punishing her. Because I had decided that my work was no longer available for her to assess or comment on or worry about or diminish. That part of my life had become, by deliberate choice, entirely private from her. She noticed. I could tell she noticed because she stopped asking about the business, which was the one topic she had always used as an entry point for the particular brand of concerned criticism that had defined our dynamic for years. Without that entry point, our conversations became lighter and more surface level and, in a strange way, more pleasant. I was polite. I was kind. I was a good daughter in all the ways that were available to me without compromising the internal decision I had made at my kitchen table the night after Easter. Nana Ruth called me every few weeks. She asked real questions and listened to the real answers and told me at least 3 times that she had always known this would work out. She was the only family member I told about the conference speaking invitation. She cried a little, which made me cry a little, and then she said, "Don't you dare tell your mother before you're ready. Let it be yours first." I kept it mine for a long time. The call from my mother came on a Tuesday afternoon in November, 15 months after Easter. I was at my desk working on a brand strategy document for a client when my phone lit up with her name. I answered it the way I always answered her calls now. Present, warm, and inwardly prepared for anything. She opened with small talk. The weather. My father's new hobby of weekend woodworking. A neighbor's health situation. I listened and responded and waited. Then she said, "I wanted to ask you something. And I want you to hear me out before you respond." I said, "Okay." "My retirement party is in March," she said. "The district is doing a dinner at the Marriott. 60 people. Colleagues, friends, family. They've asked me to have someone give a keynote speech about my career and my impact." She paused. "I want it to be you." I held the phone and said nothing for a moment. "I know things have been a little strained between us," she continued, moving carefully through the sentence the way people do when they are acknowledging something without fully naming it. "But you're the best writer in this family and you know how to speak in front of people, and I think you would do it beautifully. If you're willing." I looked out my office window at the street below. "Can I think about it?" I said. "Of course," she said. "Take all the time you need." We said goodbye and I set the phone down on my desk and sat for a long time with the particular complexity of what had just happened. Let me tell you what was happening inside me during that silence, because this is the part of the story that I think matters most. The easy version of what I was feeling was satisfaction. And I would be lying if I said satisfaction was not present. 15 months after being told in front of 14 people that I was failing, the woman who had said it was calling to ask if I would represent her publicly at the most significant professional event of her life. That was not nothing. But underneath the satisfaction was something more complicated. Something that had less to do with the symmetry of the situation and more to do with who I had become in the 18 months since Easter. Because the woman who had sat in a parking lot that Easter evening absorbing the weight of public diminishment and the woman sitting at this desk right now were not the same woman. The woman at the desk had stopped needing her mother's validation so completely that the request, which would have been a moment of pure aching longing 2 years ago, was now just a decision. A practical, considered decision about whether to do a thing, evaluated on its own merits rather than on what it meant about whether she was finally loved enough. That shift was the real thing that had happened in 18 months. Not the revenue. Not the clients. Not the conference invitations. The shift. I called Dr. Sandra Okafor that evening. She asked me to speak at her retirement party. I said, "Boss, how do you feel about it?" "I'm trying to figure out if I want to do it for the right reasons," I said. "What would the wrong reasons be?" "Proving something," I said. "Standing up at that podium and using the opportunity to make a point about Easter." "And the right reasons?" I thought about it. "She's my mother," I said finally. "Whatever has happened between us, she spent 31 years doing work that mattered. Students were better educated because of decisions she made. That's real and it deserves to be honored." "Can you honor it genuinely?" Sandra asked. I sat with that question for a long moment. "Yes," I said. "I think I actually can." I called my mother back the next morning and told her yes. She exhaled in a way that had more relief in it than she probably intended to reveal. "Thank you," she said. "It means a lot to me." I told her I would need time with her over the next few weeks. To hear her talk about her career, the moments that had mattered, the things she was proudest of. That I wanted the speech to be genuinely about her and her work rather than a generic tribute. She agreed immediately. She sounded, for the first time in longer than I could remember, slightly uncertain. As if my professionalism in approaching the task had introduced a variable she hadn't expected. We spent 4 sessions together over the following 6 weeks. An hour each time sitting at her kitchen table with a recorder and my laptop, while she talked about 31 years of public education. About the early years when she was still figuring out how to have authority without distance. About the curriculum overhaul that had taken 3 years and enormous political capital and had ultimately improved standardized outcomes for 12,000 students. About the 2 principals she had mentored who had gone on to become district leaders themselves. About the retirement she had both anticipated and feared, the way all people who have built their identity around their professional life fear the moment it ends. He talked and I listened. And somewhere in those 4 sessions, something shifted between us that had nothing to do with the business and nothing to do with Easter. She was telling me the real story of her working life, not the managed version she presented at family dinners. And I was receiving it with full professional attention and genuine respect for what she had built. In the 3rd session she said something I had never heard her say before. "I think I was harder on you than I needed to be," she said. Not as a preamble to anything. Not connected to any specific conversation. Just placed there plainly in the middle of a sentence about something else entirely. "I think I worried about you more than I believed in you. And I think those 2 things are not the same." Kept my voice even. "I know." She looked at me for a moment. "You turned out to be right," she said. "About the business. About leaving. About all of it." I nodded. She looked like she wanted to say more and didn't know how. "It's okay, Mom," I said. And I meant it. Not as absolution exactly and not as a dismissal. Just as a true statement about where I was standing. "It's okay." The retirement dinner was on a Saturday in March. 60 people in a banquet room at the Marriott, round tables with white linens, a slideshow of photos from 31 years running on a screen at the front. My father in his good suit looking proud and slightly overwhelmed. Kevin and Amber at a table near the front. Nana Ruth in a navy dress she had bought specifically for the evening. I was the last speaker before dinner. I had written the speech over 6 weeks and practiced it until I could deliver it without notes while still making it sound like the first time I was saying the words. It was 7 minutes long. It covered 3 decades of work in language that was specific and genuine and built toward an ending that was, I felt, true enough to be worth saying out loud. I stood at the podium and looked at the room. I found my mother at the head table. She was looking at me with an expression I had not seen on her face before. Not the assessing look I had grown up with. Not the worried look. Something more open than either of those. Something that looked from 40 feet away like she was seeing me clearly for the first time. Maybe she was. I began. I talked about what it meant to spend 31 years in service of other people's children. About the particular kind of commitment that requires, not just professional competence, which my mother had in abundance, but a sustained daily willingness to keep believing in the potential of young people even when the systems around them made that belief costly. I talked about the curriculum work and the mentorship and the thousands of small decisions that added up over 3 decades to a measurable difference in the lives of people who would never fully know her name. I talked about what it had meant to grow up as her daughter. Carefully, honestly, in language that was specific enough to be real and generous enough to be kind. I talked about inheriting her work ethic and her stubbornness and her absolute refusal to accept that something could not be done better than it was currently being done. I talked about what I had learned from watching her build something over 31 years that no single moment or setback could undo. And then I said the last thing. The thing about people who build for the long term, I said, is that the results don't show up on a single day. They show up slowly in the choices of people who were shaped by their work, in the institutions that are better because they were there, in the simple, stubborn fact that what they built lasted. I looked at my mother. You built something that lasted. That is the whole thing. That is everything. The room applauded. My mother was crying. Not the contained, dignified kind. The real kind. My grandmother was also crying. She caught my eye and gave me the same small single nod she had given me at Easter 2 years earlier, and I held on to it the same way I had held on to the first one. After the dinner, after the photographs and the conversations and the long goodbyes, my mother found me near the exit. She put both hands on my face the way she had when I was small. That was the best thing anyone has ever said about me, she said. I looked at her. This woman who had worried more than she had believed, who had been harder than she needed to be, who had said something at a table in front of 14 people that had sent me to a parking lot for 20 minutes on an Easter evening. I meant every word, I said. As I had. I want to tell you what I took from those 2 years because I think it is the thing worth keeping from a story like this. I did not take revenge. Not because I am particularly virtuous, but because I understood, somewhere in the quiet of my parking lot that Easter evening, that the most complete response to being diminished by someone you love is not to diminish them back. It is to build something so real and so undeniable that the diminishment eventually becomes irrelevant. Not irrelevant because it didn't hurt. It did hurt. It hurt for a long time. Irrelevant because you outgrew the need for the person who did it to correct the record. My mother has never formally apologized for Easter. Not in the specific, naming-thieving way that a formal apology requires. She has said things. The comment in our 3rd session, the look on her face at the podium, that I recognize as the closest she is capable of coming. I have decided that is enough. Not because she deserves the grace of my deciding that, but because I do not want to spend the years I have left with her waiting for something that may never come in exactly the form I want it. She is 63. She is retiring. She told 40 years of children what she expected from them, and some of them rose to meet it and some of them didn't, and she did the best she knew how to do. So did I. The business has continued to grow. I have 31 clients now. I speak at 3 or 4 conferences a year. I turned down a job offer last fall that would have paid me more than I made in my first 3 years of the business combined, because I understood by then what I was building and why the offer, however flattering, was pointing in the wrong direction. Nana Ruth called me the week after the retirement party. You were magnificent, she said. But I knew you would be. You knew before I did, I said. That's what grandmothers are for, she said. And then she laughed the way she always laughs, like someone who has been watching the story long enough to know that the right ending was always coming. I think about Easter sometimes. About the 14 people and the quiet and the fork and the piece of ham. I think about the woman who drove home that evening and sat in her parking lot and made a decision not because she was certain it was going to work but because the alternative, waiting at that table forever, had finally become more expensive than the risk. I am so grateful she made that decision. She is the reason I am standing where I am standing. So here is what I want to leave you with. If someone you love, someone who is supposed to be in your corner, has used their knowledge of you to make you smaller in front of people, I want you to hear this. You do not have to argue with their assessment. You do not have to convince them they are wrong. You do not have to wait for them to correct the record before you are allowed to believe in yourself. You just have to run the experiment. Build the thing. Do the work. Show up every day for the version of yourself that exists past their opinion of you. And trust that reality, given enough time and enough genuine effort, will say what needs to be said more clearly and more permanently than any argument you could have had at the table. That is the whole lesson. That is everything I learned between Easter and a Marriott banquet room 18 months later. Build something real. Let it speak. And make sure when you stand up to speak for the people who doubted you, that every word you say is true. Because that is the most complete thing you can do. Not revenge. Truth. Tell me in the comments. Has someone in your family ever made you smaller in public? And what did you do with it? I want to know. Because I think the answer to that question is one of the most important things a person can tell you about who they are becoming.